In 18th century Europe, there was a street where people were locked in every night. The gates sealed at sundown. They stayed locked on Sundays and on every Christian holiday. 3,000 people lived inside 300 meters of a Frankfurt lane with no exit and no choice. You could not trade freely outside the walls. You could not own property beyond them. You could not sit in a public park or enter a coffee shop. You were excluded from the broader economy not by circumstance but by law, by deliberate design. And from inside that restriction came the family that would go on to finance the British Army that defeated Napoleon while simultaneously maintaining financial relationships with Napoleon's own government. That would supply emergency gold to the Bank of England when it faced systemic collapse. That would arrange sovereign loans for Prussia, Austria, France, and Brazil within a single decade. His name was Amschel Rothschild, who later became mayor of Frankfurt. The Rothschilds did not escape the ghetto by accident. They escaped it by building a financial architecture so indispensable that the governments which had locked the gates could no longer function without them. This is that story. And what it reveals about the relationship between information, capital, and sovereign power is as relevant today as it was in 1815. The lane was called the Judengasse. It had existed in Frankfurt since the 12th century, and by the time Mayor Amschel Rothschild was born into it in 1744, it had become one of the most overcrowded and legally constrained spaces in Europe. Frankfurt's Jewish community was permitted to live only within its borders. The number of Jewish marriages permitted per year was capped by city ordinance to prevent population growth. The residents could not freely choose their occupations. They paid special taxes that Christian citizens did not. The walls around the Judengasse were not metaphorical. They were stone. Mayor Amschel's father was a money changer and small-scale merchant. His parents had intended him for the rabbinate and sent him to study in Fürth. When both of them died of smallpox while he was still a boy, those plans dissolved. He was sent instead as an apprentice to the banking house of Simon Wolf Oppenheimer in Hanover, one of the most respected financial firms in the German states. He spent years there learning the mechanics of foreign exchange, bill discounting, and the movement of capital across borders. When he returned to Frankfurt, he brought that knowledge back with him, and he put it to work in a way that nobody around him was doing. His first significant breakthrough came through an unlikely vehicle, rare coins. Mayor Amschel had developed a genuine expertise in ancient currencies from Rome, Persia, and the Byzantine Empire, and he understood that European nobility had a consuming passion for collecting them. He compiled catalogs, he cultivated aristocratic clients, and that coin business eventually brought him into contact with Crown Prince Wilhelm of Hesse-Kassel, a relationship that would prove to be the foundation of everything that followed. The House of Hesse-Kassel had built its fortune through a particular and profitable arrangement. They rented out their soldiers. The Hessians, as they were known across Europe, were mercenaries of considerable military reputation, and their rulers made enormous sums leasing them out to whoever needed fighters. The British Crown, for example, hired 16,800 Hessian soldiers to help suppress the American Revolution. The fees from these arrangements had made the Hessian electors extraordinarily wealthy, and Mayor Amschel Rothschild had made himself their trusted financial manager. By 1789, he had been formally appointed court factor to the Hessian court. The relationship gave him access to capital, to noble clients, and to a kind of protective legitimacy that Jewish merchants in Frankfurt could rarely achieve. But Mayor Amschel was not thinking about his own generation. He was thinking about the next one. He had 10 children, 5 sons, and he had a plan for each of them that was almost architectural in its clarity. He would send each son to a different major European city. Together, as a coordinated network, they would build a banking operation unlike anything Europe had seen. Not one bank in one city, but 5 banks in 5 cities, connected by a private courier system faster and more reliable than most government dispatch networks, sharing information, capital, and opportunity in ways that no single institution could match. His instructions to his sons before they dispersed were precise and consistent. Always seek business with the ruling houses, not the merchants, and keep the wealth inside the family. Amschel Mayer stayed in Frankfurt to manage the original firm. Salomon moved toward Vienna. Karl eventually made his way to Naples. James, the youngest, known also as Jacob, settled in Paris, and Nathan, the third son and arguably the most gifted of them all, was dispatched to England. Mayor Amschel Rothschild had spent his life constructing a system. His sons would run it. And the world would never be the same. If you have not subscribed to the channel yet, please do it now. This is exactly the kind of financial history we cover, the documented mechanisms behind the events that shape the modern world. Every subscriber genuinely matters to what we are building here. Now hold that picture in your mind. A family network deliberately positioned across 5 European capitals, connected by a private intelligence system, operating under unified strategic direction from a Frankfurt patriarch who understood sovereign finance at a level most governments had not yet reached. Because into that network steps the most disruptive force in European history since the Roman Empire, and he is about to make the Rothschilds very, very rich. Nathan Rothschild arrived in Manchester in 1798. He was 21 years old. His English was poor. His starting capital was approximately £20,000, supplied by his father, equivalent to roughly £2,200,000 in today's money. And he proceeded within a decade to transform himself from a modestly funded apprentice into one of the most significant financial operators in Britain. The Manchester of that era was electric with industrial energy. Cotton mills were transforming the English Midlands into the manufacturing engine of the world. Nathan saw immediately what most people around him were too close to the work to see. The market was structurally inefficient. Middlemen were extracting profit from every transaction between manufacturer and final buyer. Nathan cut straight through this structure. He went directly to the mills, bought in bulk, offered cash up front, and traded on volume with narrow margins. His competitors could not understand how he kept undercutting them. The answer was straightforward. He had eliminated every intermediary standing between himself and the source. In a few years, he had turned £20,000 into a substantial fortune. He was shipping English textiles across Europe, a difficult feat in those years because Napoleon's continental blockade had sealed off most legitimate trade routes between Britain and the continent. Goods had to be smuggled, rerouted through neutral ports, and moved through cooperating intermediaries. Nathan, through the family network, was exceptionally good at navigating this. His brothers in Frankfurt and elsewhere acted as receiving agents. Coded letters moved constantly between them. The family courier system was faster and more reliable than most government dispatch networks of the era. By 1804, Nathan had moved to London and registered as a banker. He founded what would become N.M. Rothschild & Sons at New Court on St. Swithin's Lane in the city. He was done with textiles. He had a much larger vision. And then something happened that would permanently alter the trajectory of the Rothschild story. Something that began not in London or Manchester, but in the panicked flight of a German elector from a French army. In 1806, Napoleon's forces invaded Hesse Castle. Wilhelm the Elector, the man whose grandfather had made the Rothschild family's first significant breakthrough possible, fled into exile in Denmark. He was leaving behind one of the largest private fortunes in Europe, accumulated over decades of mercenary fees, shrewd investment, and sovereign accumulation. Before he fled, he entrusted a significant portion of that fortune to Mayor Amschel Rothschild in Frankfurt. Estimates place the sum at around £600,000, equivalent to something close to £60 million in modern terms. What Nathan did with access to a portion of that capital is documented in the Rothschild archive. He made large purchases of gold from the East India Company in 1808, bought it at a discount, and sold it at a profit to the British government, which desperately needed bullion to pay its armies on the continent. One source noted that Nathan made no fewer than 4 separate profits on this single chain of transactions: on the purchase of Wellington's paper bills, on the sale of the gold itself, on its repurchase, and on forwarding it to Portugal. The Jewish Encyclopedia described this series of deals as the beginning of the great Rothschild fortune. But what it also did was something more important than the profit itself. It introduced Nathan Rothschild to John Charles Harries, the Commissary General at the British Army, the man responsible for supplying Wellington's forces on campaign. That relationship would define the next 7 years and place the Rothschild family at the center of the largest military financing operation in modern European history. By 1811, Nathan had formalized his arrangement with Harries and the British government. His task was to get money, in the form of gold and silver coin, in the local currency of wherever Wellington happened to be fighting, into the hands of British soldiers and Allied governments across a continent that Napoleon was simultaneously trying to seal off from British commerce. The scale of this task was almost incomprehensible, moving hundreds of thousands of pounds in hard currency across borders in the middle of a war with no electronic networks, no wire transfers, no international banking infrastructure beyond what private operators had built themselves. There were horses, ships, couriers, coastal watchposts, and borders guarded by hostile armies. The Rothschilds did it repeatedly and reliably at a 2% commission on every transaction. In 1815 alone, the single year that culminated in the Battle of Waterloo, Nathan and his brothers provided nearly £9,800,000 in subsidy loans and bullion transfers to Britain and our continental allies. In today's money, that figure represents something in the range of £850 million. The coins that passed through the Rothschild network came from Mexico, the United States, Austria, Prussia, Colombia, India, and from the French government itself. Coins minted under Louis XVI, the Revolution, and Napoleon. Nathan kept a sample coin from each shipment, preserved in a velvet-lined case. That case still exists in the Rothschild archive. It is one of the most quietly astonishing artifacts of modern financial history. Now here is where the story becomes genuinely complex. Because while Nathan in London was bankrolling the British war effort, his youngest brother James was in Paris. And Paris at this point was Napoleon's city. James Mayer Rothschild had arrived in Paris in 1811, initially to help Nathan coordinate gold purchases and the movement of bullion across Europe. He was 19 years old. He quickly established himself as a capable operator in the French capital, building relationships with Napoleon's finance ministers, with suppliers, and with the logistical infrastructure of the French imperial war machine. What can be documented is this. The Rothschild family as a network was operating on both sides of the conflict simultaneously. They were moving goods through Napoleon's blockade. They were maintaining relationships with French government officials. And in the early years of the war, they were facilitating financial flows that served both the French and British war efforts. A Rothschild letter could cross a border that would have stopped any other courier, because they had made themselves indispensable to both sides. Neither government could afford to obstruct them. This was not treason on Nathan's part. It was something colder and more calculated than that. It was a deliberate business strategy. The Rothschild family had built their entire model on the principle that no single political outcome should be capable of destroying them. By being present and useful to both sides, they guaranteed that whoever emerged victorious would still require their services. This is what Mayor Amschel had meant when he told his sons to always seek business with ruling houses. Ruling houses go to war with each other. The banker who serves both sides survives either outcome. Over time, however, the family's calculations began to shift in a specific direction. By 1813 and 1814, the tide of the war had turned decisively against Napoleon. His Russian campaign had ended in catastrophe. Somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 soldiers lost to battle, cold, and starvation. The Grand Army was a shadow of what it had been. Wellington was driving French forces back across Spain toward the Pyrenees. Prussia had turned against France. The coalition was tightening. Nathan, reading these movements with the eyes of a financier rather than a general, began concentrating resources on the British side with an intensity he had not previously shown. He was not only supplying Wellington's campaign, he was betting through his bond positions and forward currency contracts that Britain would win. Napoleon abdicated in April 1814 and was exiled to Elba. Bond prices rose. Nathan, who had been accumulating British government securities throughout the war, saw his positions appreciate substantially. And then Napoleon came back. This is the kind of documented financial history that the standard account of the Napoleonic Wars almost never tells you. If this channel is new to you, please subscribe now. In March 1815, Napoleon escaped from Elba, landed in southern France with a small force, and marched north. The troops sent to arrest him joined him instead. The king fled. Within days, Napoleon was back in the Tuileries Palace and Europe was at war again. For Nathan Rothschild, this was a moment of maximum personal financial exposure. And it is in this moment that his particular genius becomes most visible. Napoleon's return from Elba was a financial nightmare for Nathan. He had been counting on a long peace. He had deployed enormous resources on the assumption that the war was over. Gold purchases, extended credit, forward commitments, all predicated on European stability. Now, with Napoleon back in power, all of those calculations were suddenly fragile. If Napoleon won, if he managed to defeat Wellington at whatever battlefield they chose, British bonds would crater, Allied governments would default, and the Rothschild balance sheet would be devastated. In this moment of maximum uncertainty, Nathan did not freeze. He doubled down. He continued buying gold to supply Wellington, this time at enormous personal risk. because he understood something that his more cautious brothers in Frankfurt and Vienna did not. The chaos itself was an opportunity. If you were the one who controlled the information. By 1815, Nathan had built a private intelligence network that was arguably the fastest in Europe. He had couriers stationed at relay points across the continent. He had shipping agents in Dover, Calais, and Ostend. He maintained fast vessels ready to sail at short notice. He had carrier pigeon stations along the English coast. And he had agents embedded near the theaters of conflict with instructions to reach him with news ahead of anyone else. His brothers, Salomon in Vienna, Amschel in Frankfurt, Karl in various locations, James in Paris, each functioned as a node in what amounted to the 19th century's most sophisticated private intelligence apparatus. On the 18th of June, 1815, the two armies met at Waterloo in what is now Belgium. Wellington commanded approximately 67,000 British, Dutch, and German troops. Napoleon commanded roughly the same number of French soldiers. The battle lasted most of the day, and was by Wellington's own later admission the nearest wrung thing he had ever seen in his life. The outcome hung in the balance until the evening, when Prussian forces under Field Marshal Blücher arrived and struck Napoleon's flank. The French army collapsed. Napoleon fled. That evening, a Rothschild agent near the battlefield rushed to Dunkirk. He boarded a Rothschild vessel waiting in the harbor. The ship crossed the channel, and sometime during the night of the 19th of June, a full 24 to 48 hours before Wellington's official dispatch reached the British government. Nathan Rothschild held in his hands the knowledge that Napoleon had been defeated. Now here is where the historical record requires precision, because what happened next has been one of the most distorted episodes in modern financial history, distorted deliberately and for specific political purposes, the legend that grew up around this moment, and that was later weaponized by Nazi propaganda in the 1940s, claimed that Nathan went to the London Stock Exchange, took up his position leaning against the pillar known as Rothschild's pillar, and began quietly selling British government bonds. The crowd watched him. They knew his reputation. If Rothschild was selling, the logic went, it could only mean one thing: Waterloo was lost. Panic selling spread through the exchange. Prices crashed. And at the bottom, Nathan's agents quietly bought everything back at a fraction of its value, generating a profit of millions in a single afternoon. This story is substantially false. Historians at the Rothschild archive have examined it in detail, and their conclusion is documented. There is no evidence of the price crash the legend requires. Nathan Rothschild was not at the stock exchange in the manner described. Whatever profit he made from early intelligence about Waterloo was, in the archive's own assessment, very considerably less than £1 million. The Nazi film Die Rothschilds Aktien auf Waterloo, produced in 1940, drew on this fabricated legend as deliberate anti-Semitic propaganda. It was built on a myth that French socialist pamphlet writers had invented in the 1840s, writing under pseudonyms and making claims that the primary sources do not support. The documented reality is both more honest and more impressive. Nathan did receive early news of Waterloo. A letter from a Rothschild employee named John Roworth, written in the weeks after the battle, contains a postscript, noting that Nathan had done well from the early information about the victory. But the truly extraordinary profit came from what he did in the weeks and months that followed. And this was not manipulation or deception. It was a masterpiece of financial reasoning applied at exactly the right moment. Nathan's reasoning after Waterloo was precise and documented. The war was over. After more than 2 decades of nearly continuous conflict, Europe was finally at peace. The British national debt had tripled during the wars to £745 million. British government bonds, consols, had been battered downward by years of uncertainty. A 3% consul that had traded near £96 before the wars had sunk below £60 during the years of maximum danger. But now, with Napoleon permanently exiled to the South Atlantic island of St. Helena, with European stability apparently guaranteed, with government borrowing expected to fall substantially, those bonds were going to recover. Nathan was certain of it. So he bought. He bought massively. He bought even as his brothers sent him increasingly desperate letters from Frankfurt and Vienna urging him to take his profits. Salomon wrote in 1815, "All you ever write is, pay this, pay that, send this, send that." Nathan ignored them and kept buying. He held through months of market uncertainty, through periods where prices wobbled and his position looked precarious to everyone watching it from the outside. By late 1817, his patience had been fully repaid. British government bond prices had risen more than 40% from where he had been accumulating them. He sold. The resulting profit, adjusted for the purchasing power of the pound, was worth something in the region of £600 million in today's money. It was, by the assessment of financial historians, one of the most audacious and successful long-term bond trades in the history of European finance. The effect on the Rothschild position in European sovereign finance was permanent and structural. By 1820, Nathan's personal fortune was estimated at £2 million, equivalent to over $200 million today. More significantly, the Rothschild Bank was now functioning in practice as the unofficial lender of last resort to the entire continent. When the Bank of England faced a liquidity crisis in 1825 and 1826, it was Nathan Rothschild who supplied enough gold coin to prevent a systemic collapse. A private banker, the son of a Frankfurt ghetto resident, providing emergency backstop financing to the central bank of the world's most powerful empire. The Times newspaper noted in December 1823 that Nathan had played so important a part in the history of the present generation that it is most probable that his proceedings will never be forgotten. In 1818, Nathan arranged a £5 million loan to the Prussian government, the kind of sovereign lending that had previously been the exclusive domain of monarchs and their treasuries. He did it again for Austria, for France, for Brazil. Within a decade of Waterloo, the Rothschild banks in London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples had collectively become the largest private banking network in the world, holding positions in more sovereign debt than any single government could match. In 1871, when France was defeated by Prussia and faced a crippling war indemnity of 5 billion francs, it was the Rothschilds who arranged the financing to pay it off. In 1875, when the British government wanted to move quickly on purchasing a controlling stake in the Suez Canal Company, it was the Rothschilds in London who provided £4 million on virtually no notice, a transaction that positioned Britain as the dominant power in the critical maritime route between Europe and Asia. James Rothschild in Paris. The brother who had navigated Napoleon's capital as a 19-year-old emerged from the war not as a casualty of the regime change, but as one of the dominant financial figures of post-war France. The Bourbon monarchy that replaced Napoleon needed money to stabilize the country, pay off war indemnities, and rebuild its institutions. James provided it. He structured loans, arranged bond issues, cultivated ministers, and wove the Rothschild name into the fabric of French state finance so thoroughly that for the next several decades no French government could borrow significantly without passing through his house. Nathan Rothschild died in 1836 in Frankfurt of an infected abscess. By that point, his personal net worth amounted to 0.62% of British national income. That is not simply a measure of individual wealth. It is a measure of structural position. Wellington, who was not given to easy praise, described Nathan as the most capable, skillful, upright, and liberal agent in the whole course of his employment as an agent of the state. There is a question worth sitting with at the end of all this. Was it right for the Rothschild family to have financed both sides of a war? The honest answer is that the question is somewhat anachronistic. In the early 19th century, the financing of war was simply business. Private financiers were not expected to choose sides on moral grounds. What distinguished the Rothschilds was not the principle but the scale, the sophistication of the risk management, and the audacity of the positioning. They saw before almost anyone else that in a world governed by sovereign states and national armies, the most durable form of power is the power to say yes or no when a government needs money. Kings can be overthrown, generals can be defeated, borders can shift. But someone always has to pay the soldiers, service the debts, and keep the machinery of government functioning. The person or institution that controls that function controls far more than a treasury. Napoleon himself had understood this. He created the Banque de France in 1800 specifically to give France direct access to capital without depending on private bankers. He wanted to cut the Rothschilds and their kind out of the picture entirely. But even at the peak of his power, he could not wage war without moving gold across borders. And moving gold across borders in that era meant relying on the very network he was trying to circumvent. The family that started in a locked lane in Frankfurt, whose patriarch could not enter a public park or sit in a coffee shop, whose sons were sent out into Europe with precise instructions about how to survive in a world that regarded them as outsiders. That family within a single generation became the most powerful private financial force in the Western world. They did it by being faster with information, more disciplined with capital, and more strategically positioned to cross national boundaries than any competitor. They did it by understanding that war is not only a political event, it is a financial one. And they did it by building a system in which no outcome of the war could destroy them, because they had made themselves indispensable to every possible winner. The map in a Frankfurt archive still exists. The velvet case of coins still sits in the Rothschild archive. The bond ledgers of 1815 and 1817 are documented and open to researchers. This is not legend. It is the paper trail. And it tells a story about power that is considerably more interesting and considerably more instructive than the fabricated version that Nazi propagandists invented and that conspiracy theorists have been recycling ever since. If this is the kind of forensic financial history you have been looking for, please subscribe to the channel. And if this video changed how you think about a story you thought you already knew, share it with someone who still believes the legend. I will see you in the next one.